I think we are right on time now, and I think we will be able to admit people who are a little bit late. We normally try to appreciate everyone's commitment to the starting time, and so by the time I have to say everything that I have to say as an introduction, I think we will get those that are slightly delayed in joining us. So for people that do not know my face or my voice, and I'm Mia Mikic. I'm now functioning as an advisor at large for ARTNeT. I used to coordinate it. And it is my great privilege to say hello to all of you for our last webinar of May 2021. And we will be announcing our June schedule soon. But as we have come into this routine, we always skip the first week of a month to recover a little bit. Okay, so I will moderate the session today, and a part of moderator's duties to announce the rules of the game and how we will do it. So first of all, I will kindly ask everyone to mute themselves and to also try not to be on camera unless they're really speaking, because it may cause some sort of distraction, really. You are most welcome to put your questions in the chat box. I think the people who already have sent me some questions, that was very useful, and I have shared them with the speakers. And also, of course, if you would like to raise the question yourself, do raise your hand, and I will try to notice you and ask you to raise the question. It would be good to keep the questions until we end up with both presentation and the comment. But if there is something really urgent or for clarification purposes, or you have a technical problem, try to alert us beforehand. Okay, so today's topic is given under the name Trade War Technology and Global Value Chains, and it's not a topic for a small talk. It's a big, I think, discussion topic going on for some time, and definitely will be going on for many years to come. To introduce this topic or our conversation on this topic, we have asked one of our ARTNeT advisors for digital economy, Dr. Gloria Pasadilla, who is also partner and business director of leadership design in Singapore, to really summarize her own and other research on the main issues under this topic, and to present it to us within 30 minutes. And then we asked also our collaborator, Mr. Adnan Sheric, who is the economist at UNIDO, is also a leader of the industrial analytics platform at UNIDO, and he has been working with both ARTNeT and ESCAP for many years, to bring us up to date with what UNIDO is working in terms of the industrial analytics and how it is all connected with both value chains and technology. So I will not be wasting any more of the time that we have allocated, and I will invite Gloria to start sharing her slides, please. Gloria.
Sure, Mia.
Mm-hmm.
Can Can you see anything? I can't see anything.
No, we see end of the slides. So maybe you have to go to the first slide. Yes, you have to go to the first slide.
Here, no more surprises, huh?
No, yeah, because I think when you tested, you left it on the last slide. So
yes,
that's
okay.
I think one more. Yeah.
Okay. I think we're
right. Yes, this is it.
Okay, so good afternoon to those who are in Asia, and good morning to.
You have to go to the present. Sorry, you have to go to the presentation mode. Something shifted.
Okay. Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna put you on gallery so that, okay. So good afternoon, everyone, for those who are in Asia, and good morning to those who are in Europe, to our friends in Europe. And thank you for joining us in this ARTNeT webinar. So today I'm going to talk about tech, the trade war, technology, and the global value chains, and I hope to give you some useful things for your policy and research work. I'm going to follow the following outline. So I'll talk a little bit about the context on why the trade war, but I'm gonna get it mostly from the two papers that I've written. For one for AMRO, which is on the GVCs in the post-pandemic new normal. This is the thematic chapter of this year's AMRO, the SAM+3 Regional Economic Office Regional Economic Outlook 2021. And then another paper which I did for ARTNeT, which is the next generation non-tariff measures, which was mostly talking about data policies as the next as a non-tariff measures. And yeah, so I'll talk about first the context on the technology war, and then talk about some of the data policies and how it affects the GVCs and some of the impact on the GVCs and trade of the trade war and the data policies. So first, just a little introduction. I think you're very convinced about this, that the technology is pervasive throughout the supply chain, whether from the manufacturing side, 3D printing, robotics, automation, into the trade supply chain. The pre-export, they need smart contracts, cloud-based solutions. The transport and shipping, logistics, they need the blockchain. They use more and more blockchains are getting to be used. And then also in the trade financing aspect, smart contracts are used, big data analytics are used, et cetera, et cetera. So technology is pervasive in trade and supply chain. And the reason for the current trade war is essentially this, that there is a belief that he who dominates technology, the country that dominates technology, will dominate the world. Because at the heart of all this trade war actually is a race for dominance in technology leadership. And why is that? Because in many modern technologies, the ICTs in particular, they exhibit a network effects, and usually these network effects is like, you're very familiar with it. It's like a snowballing thing where the larger you are, the bigger the number of users and participants in the market, the more useful it is, and the more it grows. And therefore, these technologies usually create a winner takes most or winner takes all characteristic, with the outcome in markets of a monopoly or oligopolistic market structure. And there's a huge benefit in being the first mover that can dominate the global standard also, when a particular manufacturer can establish a huge user base and obtain architectural franchise. And of course, under this trade war between the United States and China, we cannot discount the security aspect of the technology competition between them, because many of the technologies that are going to be in the future will also be used, are also important for defense purposes and for security. So you're very familiar of the many tech-related trade and investment measures that both countries have imposed on each other. And they are not usually tariff measures. I think somebody asked a question about tariffs, but they are mostly on non-tariff measures, particularly on licensing, on export bans, on investment restrictions, for example, and even domestic regulations of banning certain equipments being imported into the country. And some of the data policies or digital trade policies that have been admitted that predated the current trade war, which was, of course, the Great Firewall of China and the cross-border data transfer restrictions, which have been a point of contention in many trade talks between the two countries. So, and now where is the competition between these two countries in more palpable than in the semiconductors production? Because semiconductor is very important because the chips are the ones that power many of the advanced technologies in the future. It is in a sense the heart of the technology war between the two of them. And semiconductor is a global industry. It has huge number of countries that participate in it. Some are major players, some are minor players. And the major players are Japan, the United States, of course, Netherlands, South Korea, Japan, Chinese Taipei. Yeah, so I'll talk more about this, but what really actually sparked most of the alarm bells, the alarm bells started ringing, was because of the Made in China 2005 initiative in China, 2025 initiative of China, where they wanted to be self-sufficient in chip manufacturing, because in fact China imports a lot more of semiconductors than oil. So a huge portion of their imports are actually on semiconductors. But of course, it's because they are part of a value chain. So part of that is really they import in order to export. And that particular initiative of Made in China, it was taken as a challenge to the US leadership in the semiconductor industry. Here you can see some studies done by others that China had actually grown a lot in their fabrication capacity in semiconductor manufacturing, where here they have about 15% of the global production of semiconductors. But when you adjust it for capacity, they only have actually 3% of global production of the advanced chips. The ones that actually dominate this area is Chinese Taipei, and of course South Korea and the United States. These are the major players for the advanced semiconductors. And how China is going to be affected with the trade war and the export controls is that from a 3% share of the advanced manufacturing of semiconductors, it can go down to about only 0.2% of global production. The other types of semiconductors, which are the lower quality ones, they are not going to be much affected. But the advanced chips, they're going to be a major setback for China. So let's understand a little bit more the supply chain of semiconductor. So essentially, it can be divided into three major phases, or probably four. So you have the research and development, the design, and then the manufacturing itself, the assembling, testing, and packaging, and the distribution. So in many of these, there's only actually one country that has a fully integrated system in the sense that they can do the research and development, they can do the design, they can do the manufacturing, assembly, and testing within the country. But for the rest of the other countries, usually they take care of specific nodes of the value chain, of the supply chain. So, and then also the other thing that needs to highlight here is that the United States really has a critical, a strong control over the supply chain of semiconductor production. Because, for example, in terms of the design, for example, while other countries and other key players, like, for example, Huawei, had grown and had improved a lot in the design of chips, they are also highly dependent on some of the equipments, like, for example, the electronic design automation. They are important for the design of chips, and the United States has intellectual property control over that. Similarly, in terms of the assembling and testing and the manufacturing itself, for raw material supplies, Japan has a dominance in the production of wafers and silicon wafers. And then also, when it comes to advanced manufacturing chips, particularly with what you call the extreme ultraviolet lithography equipment, or the EUV, only one particular company, which is based in the Netherlands, ASML, has manufactured this particular equipment. And again, the United States is putting a lot of pressure on Netherlands to block the sale of that particular equipment to China. And of course, you know, the key players of semiconductor manufacturing in the industry. The TSMC is a big player. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, of course, Samsung in South Korea, Intel in the United States, and of course, Huawei or SMIC in China. So other than in semiconductors, measures affecting the value chain in semiconductors manufacturing, the competition between the two are also being shown in competition in R&D spending and increasingly in global standard setting. So for example, here, you can see a very strong rise in the share of research and development expenditures in China. Now it's about 2% of GDP. And in terms of actual value, it's very close to the United States value of research and development. And then also, very importantly, when it comes to standards, they have improved a lot, particularly in the 5G standards. The standard essential patents, for example, here, China has about 34% of the total approved standard essential patents in 5G. Mostly these are from Huawei and ZTE, and followed by South Korea, mostly from LG and Samsung, and from the EU, which is from Ericsson and Nokia. And here you can see that the US is kind of a far fourth in terms of the standard essential patents. Here again is basically essentially talking about the same thing, which is that the standard essential patents in China, in particularly Huawei, is rather high at about 35% in terms of the analyzed release and the percentage of the SEP, the standard essential patents, as compared to the other type of families. The share of that is very high in some of these companies. And then in terms of standards, it's something that is interesting to talk about because sometimes the imposition of local standards was meant to really protect the domestic market and to develop homegrown products, and particularly in the digital arena and technology products. So for example, WAPI, which is a security protocol for the wireless local area network, which was meant to supplant the international standard Wi-Fi, was adopted by China, and it wanted it to be the only standard in the country. But there was enormous pressure for China not to do that, and it had to relent, and therefore China had to allow alternative protocol. But the WAPI remains in use, particularly for the public ICT system. And then they also use another standard, which is they call the TD-SCDMA, which is a time division synchronous code division multiple access. This is the third generation mobile telecom technology. It's a Chinese standard. Again, for both of these the idea is for security issues. So they were saying, China is saying that this is to protect the security in China, because they are worried about some of the bugs or some of the loopholes in the Wi-Fi technology. So in the case of SCDMA, in order to be compliant with the WTO, they had to seek an international recognition for TD-SCDMA, and it did, but it didn't get worldwide adoption for it. But the experience of seeking international recognition was a fruitful experience for them, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. And then another lesson is the what you call the Galapagos syndrome, because Japan in the 1980s and 90s had very, very advanced ICT technology. Actually, many of the American firms that visited China was very impressed with some of the advanced services that they had. But the thing is that Japan had its own local standard, which was meant for the local market. So Japanese manufacturers had difficulty exporting products globally because the standards they were using were meant for the Japanese market. And so this is what they call, from the ITIF guys, they call it as the Galapagos syndrome, where following this finding of an island, Ecuador, where in this particular island, certain types of variants of plants can only be found in this particular place, but not in the mainland area. So in a sense, it was something like that in Japan, that certain very advanced type of applications can only be found in Japan, but they could not be found globally. And eventually they were left behind by other manufacturers that use global standards. So in a sense, we're laying down the framework on why there is a competition also in the establishment of international standards, because it affects on your global dominance, it affects your future shares in the global market. Okay, so besides the technology measures that we discussed earlier, there are also important policies that are important for global value chains, and this is on the data policies. Here, for example, on the left, you see data-driven services are the ones that are exhibiting the highest growth among the services industries, and the traditional services are growing, but more or less at a slower pace. And the IP traffic had really ballooned. I think this is not something that is very new to you. And the important thing to understand and to note for us is that across the global value chain, data is important for any supply chain to operate. So whether it is on the design or testing of the raw materials procurement, to the assembly, to the actual manufacturing, into the sales and after sales services monitoring, they need data in order for the supply chain to work. So some examples of data that need to be moved in production, for example, under the control and coordination, you need to exchange some of these data, like employment data, market data, forecast of production, performance monitoring, customer data, internal, and some of the email communications are being exchanged cross-border. And then in the pre-production, there are usage data, the scientists that are involved in a project, location data, customer data, etc., etc., etc. So you can see here, I highlighted a few of them that can be like personal data. And this is really where some of the problems in the discussions on data policies are, where people are really concerned about how to protect personal data. And because of that, of course, protection of personal data is only one, and data privacy is also only one of the objectives. But also another major objective of data policies is security issues. So, and there are various regulations that vary from being very stringent to being more open. So here from the left, you will see the more stringent ones, which sometimes countries can require domestic storage, local storage. That means that the data cannot, or the domestic processing, that the data that are generated from the country should be processed using the local data servers, and then, or sometimes sometimes it requires government approval to even transfer some data. So, and this is very true for in the case of China, where companies have to request permission for transfer of specific data cross-border. And then there's another more or less in the middle in terms of stringency, which are exemplified by the European Union, for example, using their data protection regulation, the GDPR, where it requires consent or consent of the subject, or findings of adequacy, where the rules should be similar in terms of privacy protection and private sector assessment, etc., etc. And of course, you have the more open system, which is more what the US has, and where there is no a priori mandatory requirements, and there's only this private sector accountability and based on voluntary standards. So what are the effects of these data rules on global value chain? So some of the burdens that it can give to business is that when they cannot monitor or support remotely their operations because the data could not be transferred, or they cannot move the data to another GVC partner, or they cannot centralize the location of the data in one location and to be able to maximize the data analytics, for example. And the responses can vary. So they can move the task to a different location, or they can use a different GVC partner. So, for example, So, for example, if let's say EU only have adequacy findings only for a specific set of countries, and let's say Vietnam doesn't pass, then some of the EU companies might be forced to use a different GVC partner. Let's say Thailand, where probably it has, just in case it had, passed the adequacy requirements of the European Union, or they can stop offering that particular services, or they can build another data center in that particular country. And the effect on GVCs is, particularly if they change the location of their operations, will be a reconfigured GVC. The chain will look different from how it would otherwise have looked. And in any case, it will increase the cost and other inefficiencies. And if you, for example, establish and run parallel IT systems, this is a redundant capacity that it will increase the costs and other inefficiencies. So at the same thing, whether it's a forced localization or some restrictions on cross-border data transfers, the effect is similar, that there is a change in the GVC setup. It can change the GVC setup and increase the costs and other inefficiencies in the system. And with regards to the establishing of local data centers, of running excess capacities in this area, this depends a lot on the size of the local market, because if it is a very small market, it's probably the case that they will just run. They will not establish a parallel system, a parallel data center in that particular market. But probably for a country like China, they might be able to force companies to establish local data centers in that particular land. So the question now is, who are the winners and losers in the tech war? The companies, a lot, given all these restrictions, are complaining or are actually lobbying for a more liberal system, because they are losing a lot of revenues. I mean, for even the US companies that cannot sell the equipment to China for semiconductor manufacturing, they are losing revenues. And the loss of revenues can affect their research and development activities. They end up lacking access in the China market. And also the Chinese companies also lose access to advanced technologies. For China, it's a setback in technology acquisition because, as I've shown earlier, their capacity in global production of advanced manufacturing chips can go down from 3% to even smaller share to 0.2%. And their ambition of being self-sufficient is set back in a way because of the lack of access to advanced technologies. But at the same time, it gives them greater determination towards technology self-sufficiency because they cannot be hostage to controls like what they are having now. And their desire to de-Americanize their supply chains is there. And for the US and allies, of course, they lost their economies of scale when they cannot have access to a big market in Asia. They lost China market. But at the same time, it's renewing EU and US alliance, particularly in other areas, like in terms of standard settings, for example, putting pressures on government subsidies, and also in terms of the standard setting organizations where they find that China had really grown in influence and has key persons in specific organizations to help in terms of influencing discussions in standards. Will technology bifurcation result from the tech tensions? In the short term, by tech bifurcation, I mean a dual or multiple standards that can be in operation that can lead to lack of interoperability of devices and lack of seamless connections. And I argue that this can be a short-term result. And the effect of that will be, as I said, lack of interoperability, lack of seamless connection, loss of economies in scale, etc., etc. And an example of that is happening in 5G, for example, where Huawei has its own standard in 5G, but others are trying to put a different one because of lack of trust, perhaps, with Huawei technology. They have this open range access network standard, or they're pushing for an open source development of software and technology so that the different 5G equipments from different manufacturers can communicate. In the long run, though, my optimistic view is that in the long run, the bifurcation will not last very much because first, the competition and network effect in this sector, in technology industries, often create a winner takes most outcome. So eventually one company or one standard will dominate, will win out. And that will eventually influence the global market. And secondly, because technology itself has a way of reinventing itself or solving many of the multiple standards over time. So, for example, even in the case of in China, for example, when they were trying to impose the TD-SCDMA, it became eventually a non-binding constraint for many companies because technology had become very, very advanced that one chip can have both the TD-SCDMA, the WCDMA, or the CDMA in one chip, and they can just basically flip or switch on and off certain types of standards wherever they may be. So there is a way technology itself can solve this problem through applied program interfaces and greater advancements in chip technology. So I guess this is all. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Gloria. I know that the content of your presentation would allow for much longer talk, and thank you for keeping it short. But I think you managed very well to really put to the table so many reasons to understand how this tension between US and China and some other players is not really based on the conventional trade issues, nor it is fought through the conventional trade issues, but is much more complex. And so it's neither easy to win, or it's not gonna. I would like to share your optimism, but I think there are some indications that we may be in there for longer than we hoped, and that perhaps the outcome will not be as favorable for those that are hoping to win. Anyway, I think there will be questions and comments as we go on. But before that, let me also say that as we move from the presentations to the questions, for people to be aware of the fact that we are recording this. So that becomes, of course, more an issue with questions segment rather than the presentation. But just from those that are from Europe as well, I want to make it publicly announced. Okay, so Adnan, please take the floor now. And if you would like to go to the share screen, you can then share your presentation.
Thank you, Mia. Well, good morning from Europe, from Vienna, and good afternoon to all the colleagues who are listening in from Asia. Pleased to be here, and of course a big thanks to Mia for inviting me to present some of the work that we are currently doing at UNIDO as part of our biannual flagship report, the UNIDO Industrial Development Report 2022, which this year deals with the issue of the pandemic to a large extent, as most of the other reports that have been recently released or are currently being produced, and will feature the title, The Future of Industrialization in a Post-Pandemic World. The release date is scheduled for end of November this year, which also means for today's presentation that unfortunately I will not be able to really go into specific findings of the report, as it is still being embargoed. In fact, it's still under development. But instead, I will rather focus on trying to present you the overall framework under which some parts of the report are being developed, and that in particular relate to today's topic of discussion. And to this end, I will zoom in a bit into the chapter 3 of the report, which deals with the issue of COVID-19 and megatrends which are shaping industrialization. Just very briefly, in terms of the overall structure of the report, so the first two chapters, chapter 1 and 2, are a bit more of a stock-taking exercise. So we try to understand the impact of COVID-19 on countries, both developed and developing, and zooming, of course, specifically into its effects on industry, both at macro, meso, and also micro level, by in fact presenting some of the data that we have been collecting across countries that is firm level, and it really gives us an insight into what is happening at the level of the firms with respect to the crisis. But chapter 3 also zooms in into the issue of global value chains, and I think this brings me to the core of my today's presentation. So the starting point for the background paper that we are currently developing on megatrends and GVCs is that those megatrends that have been now going on for some time, they are not new, they're not just emerged, that they are of course challenging the status quo, and in particular changing the prospects for latecomer industrializing countries. And of course our objective there is to really understand the impact that those megatrends will have on operations and structure of GVCs, on the one hand, but on the other hand also to draw some insights as to how countries, how policy can strengthen then the ability to adapt and respond to those changes. Now, I understand that we have a very diverse audience here today, and not everyone is necessarily very familiar with the idea or the concept of GVCs. So I think it's important to just briefly revisit this existing paradigm that we have been using over the last 3 decades or so on GVCs. And that is basically the trade, investment, and development nexus. In terms of trade, of course, we know through estimations that at least 2/3 of global trade can be directly linked to this production framework. So production taking place within global production networks and trade being the result of it. And the primary beneficiaries, of course, are businesses, and not any business, but of course, the multinational enterprises that have been the driving forces behind the GVCs. And the idea here, of course, is that as they've been slicing up their operations, they've been outsourcing production to low-cost locations on the one hand, and in doing so, gained market access, resources, developed new technologies, deployed new technologies, etc. And that concept also then penetrated the development field, of course, because at least in theory, the thinking was that as the global economy emerges, developing countries in particular stand to benefit from this new framework because it opens access to markets, to know-how, skill development, technology acquisition, etc., etc. We know, however, that the results have been rather mixed in that respect. There's been very diverging ranges of participation by developing countries in GVCs. In fact, many parts of the world are still excluded or largely excluded. And there was an uneven distribution of benefits both within and between countries. Right? So I think this sort of GVC paradigm that we have observed until now is likely to change over the coming decade. And one of the conclusions I would say coming out of this research, of course, is that this is not due to COVID-19. I think what we have seen, and also done some work in the course of the last year on this topic, is in fact that there was a fairly quick rebound of GVC-driven industries. So we also see in the meantime that as economies are implementing vaccination programs, etc., that we see quick, also fairly fast rebounds in terms of GDP, in terms of oil markets, in terms of stock markets, in terms of exports, etc. So COVID-19 is not a game changer as such, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have an impact on other aspects or other megatrends that have been going on for some time, as I mentioned. And indeed, with respect to the megatrends, I think we are right now at a time where we find ourselves, you can call it, in a sort of a perfect storm. So around us, we have economic, social, environmental dynamics, of course, that are reshaping industrial systems in the first place. And I think it is through the reshaping of industrial systems that we also then see the effects, or that we can anticipate possible future effects on global value chains as well. And in this particular report, or in this particular chapter, we are zooming into 3 of those, what we consider core drivers of change in GVCs, but of course also beyond, so in fact in industrial systems. And those 3 are the economic power shifts, digital transformation that Gloria, of course, was now alluding to in her presentation, or that she was talking about, sorry, and environmental sustainability. And I think the key point here, of course, is that both individually, but so in combination, they carry significant implications on how value will be created and distributed along the value chains in the future. So what I will do is just quickly sort of zoom into those three core megatrends that we are studying in the context of GVCs. And the first one, of course, the one that is all over the place these days, both in academic and popular media, is the role of digital transformation. So this new wave of technologies that is at least promising for the time being to fundamentally change the way we produce goods and services. And it is this particular blending of production technologies and digital platforms that will redefine the way of who makes what and where. And I think in the context of new production technologies, at least when it comes to the manufacturing sector, we are talking about four key pillars. So that is artificial intelligence, that is the Internet of Things, robotics, and additive manufacturing. So if you sort of put them under one single roof, you sort of come up with this idea of a smart factory, one that replaces labor with intelligent systems and a handful of engineers making sure that everything runs smoothly. And digital platforms, of course, no need for explanation on that. It's the Alibabas and Amazons of this world, of course, that are hugely depending, or will be also hugely depending on this new production technologies. And what the possible outcome is for GVCs, of course, is this increased likelihood of backshoring, reshoring, or nearshoring, so shortening of GVCs, because what these new technologies allow you to do is sort of to convert your systems towards mass customization, which depends on speed, which in fact means that you need to be closer to your core markets. And it applies in particular to essential or strategic GVCs. I mean, of course, what we have seen in the context of the pandemic very early on were the calls by policymakers, for backshoring or reshoring, so ensuring supplies of strategic goods. So I think this feeds into this idea that we may face increased calls for industry to reconsider their location practices in the wake of the pandemic and in the wake of, or sorry, not in the wake, or as these transformations continue. And on the demand side, of course, what we see is that these digital matchmakers, so the digital platforms, that they are, of course, resetting consumer expectations. There's now wider choice, higher speed, superior services, which results in this intermediation, if you want, of GVC. So cutting out the middlemen. So we are moving away from this idea of longer linear supply chains towards one where digital platforms are in principle able to communicate with smart factories, more or less directly, cutting out the middlemen and therefore shortening also the supply chains. The second megatrend that we are focusing on is the economic power shift. And here in particular, of course, looking at demand and supply shifts. I think what has become clear over the years is that Asia, and in particular East Asia, and of course driven by China, has become the economic center of gravity. And that has been also largely built on at least two other megatrends, which is, of course, the rapidly growing middle classes and urbanization. It goes, of course, beyond China to include countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, etc. And of course, also a set of domestic demand policies that have been fostering greater regional integration on the one hand, but also growing domestic markets. And of course, that shift came on the back of the global trade slowdown since the last financial crisis, where we saw significant drops in shares of intermediate imports and FDI across the world, but at the same time, growing intra-regional trade in that particular part of the world. And I think this trend, of course, has led to a widening of those production nodes in GVCs. So radiating out of China towards many other parts of the region, which has also then concluded in this fact that we have now more developing or emerging market economies that are producing finished goods closer to their consumer markets. And as Gloria was now also discussing in her presentation, I think this pattern, of course, is being reinforced by policy uncertainty. And here in particular, I'm hinting towards the trade tensions, which are, of course, compounding these structural changes within GVCs. So I think if you take these together, what we are likely to observe as we go forward is this increased fragmentation and shortening of GVCs towards more regionalized structures that is to a very large or to a distinct, to a fairly large effect driven by geopolitical dynamics. Last but not least, of course, a hugely pressing issue, the global climate emergency, which, of course, we see as the single most important threat to sustainable development. And of course, it has direct implications for operations and future structure of GVCs. I'm listing here only kind of 3, but there are probably more that are directly related to the issue of climate emergency. We have observed over the past years extreme weather events, of course, and disasters, which have induced many of the many industries operating within global value chains to also reconsider or change their sourcing strategies. So we've been seeing this trend towards multi-sourcing, where established structures are being broken up and reconfigured in the process, to a certain extent also shortened, because there's been an increased move to focus on near sourcing as well, especially for companies that are located in Europe and the US. At the same time, there is this increasing pressure on firms to internalize environmental impacts. We see rapidly changing regulatory frameworks, which will ultimately also increase the cost of long-distance GVCs. We have now legislation initiatives in a number of countries in Europe that is very likely also now to be elevated to the EU level on mandatory due diligence, etc. So they're all likely to impose costs on long-distance GVCs, and at least to a certain extent trigger a rethink of the way that multinational enterprises are structuring their GVCs. And then, of course, climate change induced change in endowment structure of countries, especially those that rely on natural resources or that have structured their GVCs based on the natural resource endowments. This holds largely across a number of agribusiness-based value chains, but also others. And I think here also potentially lies the opportunity for many of the countries to shift focus towards new or emerging sectors such as renewables, etc., as a way also to gain a foothold into new supply chains or newly structured supply chains. I'll just conclude here in terms of the way forward and policy imperatives. This is still very much work in progress, and we have not put that much meat to the bone yet, but we're working on it. I think the key focus is on strengthening resilience. Everyone is talking about it these days. Of course, that is the direct outcome of the COVID crisis and some of the lessons learned. from it. How to do it, I think, is still a big question mark and up for discussion. I think part of the issue is, of course, the complexity of GVCs and the issue of data and transparency, which allows the firms, in fact, to really understand the risks they are facing within their supply chains. And I think there is still a lot of work to be done in that respect, in terms of properly appreciating risks and building then resilience. One particular area where we will, of course, focus our efforts, because it also closely relates to our mandate and the work that we do with the member states, is on building private and public sector capabilities. And of course, given these megatrends, I think the focus here will be on ways how to establish or develop ecosystems and networks that foster innovation and that allow countries to improve their capabilities. But also, of course, policies to grow other competences that are needed for the future, including, of course, infrastructure. In terms of sustainability, of course, a key focus will be also on promotion of new standards. And here the idea is to really learn lessons from countries that are at the forefront of introducing innovative mechanisms to support sustainability within GVCs. And last but not least, of course, the big question of how to foster cross-border cooperation on these issues. And to this end, we'll be organizing next week a high-level panel to which, of course, I would like to invite all of you present to join us, where we will be, in fact, going into more detail on, into a deeper discussion as to what it takes to foster inclusiveness and sustainability within value chains, and in particular, what role for multilateral actors like G20 and others. So I think here again, we are hoping to get some insights on this last point on the policy imperatives. If you would like to read more, of course, on some of the ongoing work, some of the think pieces and commentary that we have been producing both internally and in collaboration with external partners, I would highly recommend the IAP, of course. And in case of further questions, comments, etc., also feel free to reach out to me. Thank you very much. I hope I have not taken too, in fact, I've taken too much time. I apologize for that, but that will be it for now.
It's okay. Thank you very much, Adnan, for broadening actually the scope of discussion, if I may say so. Before I open the floor, I have to ask Gloria if you have any immediate comment, response, or add on. Gloria?
No, nothing, Mia. I think we
okay.
We give people
all right.
I
think I should actually start with I do have some questions in reserve from what I got from the email, but let me come to them next. But I need to start with basically the broader issue, and it is related to what both of you were saying. And Adnan, you said, well, everyone is really looking at resilience, right? And when you look at what elements people want to put in building that resilience, then it, despite a sort of logic, it leads actually to the inward looking and closing, right? Because everyone wants to then reduce reliance or dependency on others, thinking that resilience is actually the function of its own or one's own strength and capacity, right? However, in this multi-layer dependent world, and really all of our dependence on really sharing knowledge and ideas, that may prevent all of us actually to reach that level of resilience that we need for the long-term sustainable development. So maybe I should come back to both of you with a short comment on how do you actually see breaking through the bottlenecks of cooperation in terms of regulatory area, Gloria. We know that we have at least 3 big systems of approaches to regulation on everything related to digital, and not necessarily only data and transfer, but also IPRs, etc. And so that these big systems really are not willing to give in, and how do we see them cooperating towards then building some sort of a common platform where they can jointly, as Adnan was saying, look at the sustainable development. Do you want to go first, Gloria?
Let me see. I didn't quite get the question, but I think probably it's related to the email that you sent earlier about how it will affect the research and development cooperation. Maybe I can answer that, and I can go back to the same question later after Adnan speak. With regards to cooperation, and particularly to the research and development, I think the current trade war and the tech tension is going to usher in a very different environment in this regard, because there's going to be, for sure, a greater review of scholars exchange, for example, or even now, for example, there's even greater scrutiny over grants that are coming from other countries, and particularly when the grant is coming from China to the United States universities. And of course, the scholar exchange, which is very important for exchanging ideas and working together and having cooperation, is going to have greater scrutiny especially from the government. So it's going to be a very different world, particularly because of the competition over technology primacy. I think I'll go back to the question after I've heard Adnan speak.
Okay, Adnan, your input.
Thank you. Well, I think this is a very tough question, if I understood correct. I mean, the idea of how to foster this cross-border cooperation. I think it is probably a matter, or maybe a starting point, in fact, would be to really focus on governance issues and have clarity across the borders, in fact, what we mean by, or what is, good governance in the context of GVCs. Because I do feel, in fact, that that is the missing part, the missing platform with respect to international cooperation, where there is no common denominator on what it means to govern GVCs in an appropriate way. And if you do not have that, I think the problem then at the higher level, in terms of agreeing on cooperation mechanisms, etc., becomes immensely difficult. So I would, in fact, advocate for a bottom-up approach in that respect, where much more focus is placed on understanding operations of maybe strategic value chains to start with, because I think also it would be wrong to seek agreements that are, blueprints and that are supposed to hold across the board, because we of course know that different industries have different GVC governance structures, etc. So I think it would be a matter of really taking that sort of bottom-up approach at the industry level, whatever we may define or whatever the entities may define as strategic industries, and then really try to understand and try to get a deep insight into the operations and structure of these networks. Because this is the other issue, I think, at the core of the problem, is that even if you go to multinational firms and ask them about issues of risk management or resilience within their supply chains, they will not necessarily be able to give you very complete answers for a simple reason, because they are so complex and they are so vast. I mean, if you take the, if you take electronic equipment manufacturers, companies like Dell, etc. They have on average 5,000 to 6,000 suppliers across the world, and another 5,000 to 6,000 that they are co-sharing with other, OEMs, or OEMs also. So I think that the issue of really understanding what are the bottlenecks, what are the choking points, and how to address them across the borders actually starts there. So I think we need more data and more data transparency in that respect, to be able to better appreciate, in fact, the role of different entities, different stakeholders. And I think this, of course, approach calls for a renewed focus on public-private partnerships in that respect as well. So bringing industry on board to the policy table, etc., which is happening in many countries, but in many countries it's not, which again, limits the understanding of the policymakers, and especially those that are engaging across international borders, or what are the sticking points and where do we need to engage. So I do feel that we are, to sum up maybe my intervention, I do feel that we need to start thinking about cooperation platforms different to the ones that we have right now, and that are more tailored to the specific issues that GVCs and strategic industries are facing to start with.
So what I have not heard from either one of you is the role of trade and trade governance. And where do we, where is the place for the, say, regional trade agreements or multilateral trade system in all of this?
It's a very complicated issue, as you know, because these are two big, players in the room. What can potentially happen, and I'm surmising is actually what's happening, is that each one of them is going to try to influence the governance of their specific RTAs. And I think it's happening now. So for example, China would like to influence the governance, and it will have a strong say in the Asia, the RCEP and all the related types of trade agreements. Whereas in the US, will always be vying for the USMCA type of approach. So I think in terms of governance, it becomes again a very different type of approach by each one. How the WTO will be able to do something about it, well, I think it's a very interesting question. I don't know how they'll manage, but I think in terms of governance, in terms of also in terms of standard setting, for example, in international organizations for standardization, for example, or in ITU, what is happening is that there is again competition for the voice in those type of institutions. So yeah, so this is where the problem is. It's like, whoever shouts the loudest will be the ones heard, and so it depends on how the it's a complicated issue, as you for sure know, and it requires a lot of good diplomatic skills on all parts to be able to continue talking.
Okay, Adnan, you want to comment on that at all? No? Okay, good.
Or to someone else, but I fully agree. I mean, I think there's absolutely a need for new provisions and maybe even a new generation of trade and investment agreements, of course, that take these things into consideration. My point was rather what comes before that, and I think what we are really missing at present is evidence-based.
Evidence-based, right. We both have been, actually all of us have been working on building the capacity to build the evidence. I have a very interesting comment and question from Jane. Jane, instead of me asking or reading it, if you are, I can't see you on my screen, but if you are on the screen, do you care coming on and asking it directly? Jane Drake-Brockner? Yes, please.
Hello, I'm not sure if you can actually see me. I'm not in
Yes,
the...
we can see you and we can hear you very well.
Well, it's just that I agreed with much that I heard both speakers say, and also Mia with your last comment and question in particular. I think I really agree with Adnan that COVID-19 has not been the game changer it's often claimed to be. We haven't seen as much backshoring or even nearshoring as we might have seen, particularly in the Asia region, where in fact global value chains have been relatively robust, not just resilient, but robust. They've even grown, and not just in the goods GVCs, but also in the services GVCs and even the BPO sector, where the net outcome has actually been growth, not a decline. And I also agree with Gloria's focus on regulatory heterogeneity around data localization and regulations on cross-border data flows becoming the more important determinants as a result of those underlying bigger picture shifts that Adnan pointed out. It's that regulatory heterogeneity that is more likely to cause the shifts that we sense are beginning to take place, perhaps even in our region. And so all of this means we need both a greater focus on international standard setting. I would argue not the first, not the dominant player wins all, but an evidence-based multi-stakeholder approach inside the international standard setting bodies. So we need to see more resources going into those international standard setting bodies, and we need to see more regulatory cooperation based around interoperability as a result. So exactly as you asked, Mia, I would ask exactly the same question. Surely we need to see the big shifts between, as you called them, the big three. We need to see this happen in Geneva, in the WTO JSI on e-commerce. That is where it has to happen. And the bulk of it should be happening right now before MC12. Obviously, this is not going to be finished by MC12, but much should be in place by the end of this year. And the sad thing is that not all Asian players are participating as they should be. We just do not have all of ASEAN, for example. We do not have many of the ESCAP membership involved.
Thank you so much, Jane. I think this was a less of a question, but definitely a very, very useful suggestion and a comment. Sorry for putting you on a spot like that, but and thank you very much for putting a plug in for the actually advancement of work on preparation for the MC12. And as you said, we do need to actually pay more attention on what's happening in Geneva, and hopefully we will do that quickly. I will give opportunity to Gloria and Adnan to add to that, but let me also plug in another question because we are running out of time, which is and Chansamon, if I may read it for you, or if you prefer to come on, show up. Otherwise, I'll just read it. And it says, do you think whether low-skilled labor or even labor-intensive task activities will be part of GVCs as digital transformation within the Industrial Revolution 4.0 is sort of taking place because it's already come. It just is getting really rooted into our economies. Adnan, you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. I think that's an excellent question. In fact, it's really at the core of the work that we are doing, because the answer to that question carries huge implications for countries at different stages of development, of course. And I think the bottom line, at least the way I see it right now, is that if we are rapidly moving towards broad-based adoption of these technologies in the way that we manufacture goods in particular, then I do think that the bar is being significantly raised for late-comer industrializers to join the train. It's a matter of fact. I mean, there were initially these discussions of Industry 4.0 technologies, 4IR technologies, offering room or scope for developing countries to leapfrog certain stages. I think there is increasingly consensus and an understanding also among experts that this is not very likely to happen. So you cannot really move from Industry 1.0 or 2.0. And when we talk about specific parts of the world, we are still at the Industry 1 or 2.0 into 4.0, simply because it requires critical infrastructure that is not there for the time being. It requires critical skills and governance structures that are not in place, etc. So the bottom line here, I think, is that the bar will be raised. Now, I do not, and I want to distinguish between short and the long run. I think the effects in the short run may be that as many of these low-skilled or labor-intensive tasks are trying to find a new home, moving away from East Asia, that at least in the short run opens up opportunities for countries in, say, East Africa or in the MENA region or Latin America, in a way, to take on board some of these. The question is, how long you may hold that competitive advantage you may have. And I think it increases the pressure on those countries to intensify policy efforts to really move quickly towards the new production methods, the new production standards, etc., etc. So in sum, I would say that at least in the short run, they will not become obsolete, because also the technologies are not that advanced in many industries to be able to perform the work of in labor-intensive industries, because it just the technology is just not there yet. But it's gradually improving, and I think over time we will see a lot of those jobs disappear. And that poses a big question, of course, for developing countries on what alternative routes you may have to industrialize, and whether industrialization then is still the path towards growth and development. So yeah, I would maybe stop here and also give Gloria the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's a huge question again, because I would dare to comment that it's not an issue only of developing countries, but as far as lots of political sort of commitments in developed countries is towards return of manufacturing for the purpose of jobs, right? Of return of jobs. This will become actually a big thing to bite them, given the sort of a bias in terms of developing that manufacturing based on modern technology rather than the labor input, right? But it's again, it's a big issue. I'm sorry, guys, we have run out of time, and I think what this discussion again confirms is that we are just scraping the surface, and therefore, if any of the participants or the my esteemed speakers would like to revisit and come back and to, you know, add to this discussion by focusing in some specific set of questions, I would be very much happy to host you. And so I really want to thank Adnan and in particular Gloria for preparing the presentations and contributions for today's webinar. We will continue discussing all issues related to trade and development through the webinar series. And I really want to thank you all for commitment to ARTNeT and to our discussions and broadening and dissemination and creation of evidence-based policy solution for our members. So thank you very much. And unless Adnan and Gloria have something very important to say, I will want to close it because we have run out of time.
Thank you very much.
Gloria? It's fine.
No, just to say thank you, Pia, for organizing this event. I really loved it, and I have attended also other webinars, and they're all excellent. Thank you so much. You're the only one who's capable of putting together all these people in one virtual room.
Right. Okay, we will definitely, you know, with permission of speakers, we will put the presentations online together with the relevant part of the recording. And so we wish you the good rest of the day. Stay healthy and stay tuned. We will be coming with more information soon. So bye-bye now. Thank you. Thank you for participation. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.